Hello, everybody. Realignment clips back up on the YouTube channel for Breaking Points. I think you guys are going to enjoy this one. Marshall and I did an emergency podcast on Ukraine. Want to give everybody as quick of a take and as thoughtful as a take as we possibly can here, Marshall. So what do we discuss?
Yeah, we answered a bunch of audience questions. We also just talked about it. It's really wild to see a situation that's constantly evolving, and it's important that we can just talk about it openly and honestly. And I hope you all enjoyed it. These clips are going to be back every week from now on, but this is a great one to start off on, just hitting the themes, hitting the news, and hitting people's concerns.
Let's get to it.
So we have audience questions. We have our thoughts. How are you feeling, man? That's just a good place to start.
I mean, I'll be honest. I tweeted about this. I did not believe the U.S. intelligence estimates at all. So, and I want to be clear about what I said by that. When they said things like X amount of troops are around Russia, that's a fact, and that was mostly verified. So I was like, okay, I'm not saying that that's not the case. When they were like, there are kill lists, there are plans in order to take Kiev, I was like, this is crazy. I was like, nobody's going to do this in the year 2022. And the reason I thought that is I genuinely thought that this was a posturing exercise by Putin in order to ensure some sort of soft promise that Ukraine would never be a part of NATO, which he got. And maybe I thought that the maximal case was total annexation of Donetsk and Luhansk. And this is a full-scale pincer attack, Marshall. I mean, while you and I are talking, there's already been over 57 Ukrainian soldiers who were killed, something like 350 Russians. They've taken Chernobyl nuclear site. I mean, you have literal missiles slamming into Kiev. It just is complete and total insanity. I mean, there's just no way in order to describe it. It's a total flagrant breakdown of the European order by Putin for not a particularly good reason. And I guess it's a good reminder that some people in geopolitics are not rational whatsoever. And those people almost 99% of the time end up being authoritarian.
And I just want to build on something you said here. Putin actually got every single thing.
Yeah.
He actually expressly wanted. Someone had a good tweet last night where they listened to my episode of Dimitri, and he said that we were a little too unsympathetic to people who are sympathetic to Putin's claims. And you know what? I can admit there's nuance to the debate around NATO membership. There's nuance to the 90s. There's nuance to the 2000s. But in terms of Putin's actual legitimate concerns, after last weekend, there is no world whatsoever where NATO is going to admit Ukraine.
Yeah. And they shouldn't. I don't think they should. I've said that on the record.
Neither. There was actual near complete consensus, even within the U.S. foreign policy DC blob, that wasn't going to happen. And even if the U.S. did want it, Germany would have vetoed it. So that just was not on the table. 2, huge win for Putin. And once again, this is a Biden policy I support. No U.S. troop commitment to Ukraine. So for the legitimacy argument around his security and his concerns, everything was answered and he did it anyways. So I don't know. We'll get to questions in a second, but it's like you said, man, like this, something I think you and I should think about more is what's so frustrating about arguments around neoconservatism and the war in Iraq is that there were so many arguments that were made so improperly and dangerously back then that when they were made today, it was really easy to discount them.
Yeah, I just didn't.
So I get why.
Yeah, that's right.
When people, if you read the books that conservative center-right people were saying about Saddam Hussein in 2003, they're saying this is this existential threat. This is this madman. This is this big threat. People say that about Putin. I understand why people have a hard time taking those claims seriously. So I don't know, man. Like it seems vapid, it seems weak, but there's just actual no words for this. And obviously, all of our Jesus, almost said thoughts and prayers. And as we know,
Yeah.
that is not allowed. But don't we know what else we're supposed to say?
No, you just be like, look, it's sad. I don't know what else to say. I mean, that's what I've said too about Ukraine. It's terrible. I mean, you see people getting killed. I watch videos of people who are literally getting missiles exploding their homes. I mean, missiles slamming into historic city. And for what? That's the thing I don't really understand. I just think that Putin has dramatically overplayed his hand. There is no way that Russia's economy is nearly as resilient and what is the term? Autarkic as he thinks it is. No way. They import $250 billion a year of goods. They're essentially a gas station in terms of their exports. You can export as much as you want to China. 50% of all of Germany's imports come from Russia. That economic connection is going to be virtually cut off. On top of that, you are now a pariah state in the eyes of the world. You full-scale invaded another country, not Eastern separatists, like actual pincer movements around a country a la the 19th century. You will not win in the eyes of the public. You will not have any real allies on your side, possibly aside from the Chinese. I'm not saying that doesn't matter, but two countries against the rest of the world is not one. Here's the second one. Russian
quick thing, Saagar. Even the Chinese one is really interesting because you'll notice even the Chinese, when they will say things like Ukraine is not Taiwan. Right. So even in their own specific way, they are making clear that this is sort of like a,
they won't fully embrace it.
Because the Chinese argument is, look, like Taiwan is a part of China. If we go to war with them, it's a civil war. This isn't international aggression. When they say Ukraine is not Taiwan, they are actually saying, look, Putin, like you're invading a sovereign state. You're doing territorial conquest. Even the Chinese are acknowledging this is basically not chill.
Right. And here's the other thing too. Putin has now ensured geopolitical tension with the West for the next decade, this generation. That's a gigantic loss. He just ensured massive increase in the U.S. military defense budgets, U.S. deployments to the eastern flank of NATO to the tune of tens of thousands of troops. Germany's defense budget is probably going to double this year. France and the UK are going to do the exact same thing. The Poles, the Latvians, and the rest of them, no way they're going to take this sitting by. We are now in an era of nuclear geopolitical tension that we haven't been in since 1979. And so I just look at this and I think your domestic economy is failing. This is going to cost a colossal amount of money. I mean, any idea, just right now while you and I are talking, the Ukrainians just barred all men from the age of 18 to 60 from leaving the country, because they intend to mount a full-scale insurgency and they're handing out AK-47s in the Times Square. I have no idea how it'll all work out. Will it like immediately collapse? Maybe, maybe not. They're a proud people, and now you have to deal with that. You're going to learn the same lesson that we learned in Iraq. You break it, you buy it. Now you have 44 million people in order to maintain under your domain who you forcibly invaded and took over. I've been trying to play with a lot of history here. And Marshall, I'm curious what you think, which is that if you look at the grand sweep of the last 2 centuries of Russian leaders presiding over failed domestic economies who launch wars of aggression, it's not a good track record. Russo-Japanese 1904 was dealt explicitly in order to try and quell the rising Japanese empire. It turns into a colossal military disaster for the Russians. It ends up basically spelling the demise of the Tsar. Obviously, 1914, the Russians, to protect the great Slavic people, all of that ends in the Bolshevik Revolution. Finland, 1939. You and I just read Andrew Roberts' book, The Second World War. People forget this. Finland was a disaster for Stalin. It was the first invasion of aggression by the Soviet Union in that time, and they lost tens of thousands of people for nothing, and actually still didn't even end up getting exactly what they wanted. And then finally, Afghanistan, 1979. Every single one of those over the last 2 centuries resulted in a failed military situation and in actually really hurting all of the Russian regime at home. So history is not on the side of Vladimir Putin. The world is definitely not on his side. It's a colossally arrogant, foolish move, in my opinion. And look, I mean, I guess my biggest mistake was thinking that he was too smart to do something like this.
And I want to build on something you just said, because you just referenced France and made me think of, Emmanuel Macron.
Mm-hmm.
Putin humiliated Macron.
Yes.
Putin humiliated everyone who tried to engage with and treat him in good faith. Everyone may have seen that big picture of Macron and Putin at that big table because of COVID concerns. Macron flew. Macron is on the phone with Putin right now.
He did his best. He tried.
And he's doing his best.
Yeah.
But Putin humiliated him. And this is like the crazy thing there, which is that Putin has now established a situation where if you engage with him in good faith, you will come out looking like a fool. You won't accomplish your goals. Why would anyone possibly do that? This is the point where I want to start getting to Q&A, because we have never got so many questions so quickly. So I want to get to as many of them as possible. This first one, there's actually a set of good questions here, so I'll pick and choose. Comes from Brooks B. I'll keep people's last names out. If this isn't Hitler in the Sudetenland, what are some historical analogies that we can look to for guidance? I'll start with your answer, Saagar.
I just gave some Russo-Japanese 1904, Afghanistan 1979. Personally, I think that's probably the most apt one in terms of today, which is that what Putin did is he basically, what Brezhnev did in 1979 when they invaded Afghanistan is he just destroyed détente forever. And he made détente at the time was the idea that we can live with the Soviet Union, obviously under Richard Nixon, which is that we say, and the Kissinger famous quote is, as long as they stay within there and deal with themselves and they don't outwardly expand, whatever, we're not going to deal with it. We accept the two global powers. It, leads to these nuclear treaties, and we lead to a foreign policy in which we can live with the Soviet Union. But then foreign military adventurism with the invasion of Afghanistan invites Ronald Reagan as president of the United States, who then institutes a policy of rollback, which is that we are going to actively work as the United States in order to roll back the USSR's borders and the power projection of the Soviet Union. He has now ensured that will be the default policy in Washington and the West for decades to come. Can you imagine a more foolish move by a Russian leader? I look at it in exactly the same way, which is that the reason that the 79 invasion was launched was to try and shore up support within the Soviet Union, cover up for their failing economy. A war is exactly what the great people need. Great patriotic war, all of that. Colossal military disaster of 10 years of that experience invites huge domestic political turmoil because you have all these people whose sons are getting killed and they can't say anything. Not even the propaganda can hold them back. I look at this as a almost entirely analogous situation. And
look, before I get to the history point, I just keep thinking of ways that before Putin launched this campaign, he'd won. Do you see anyone in DC talking about regime change in Russia?
Yeah, no.
None whatsoever. Right now, the move is we punish Putin as much as possible. We punish his clique of oligarchs. But there's no claim of we're going to support the Chechens and they'll overthrow Russia. There's no claim of we're going to see mass protests in the street. They're going to force it from office. No one's even making that claim. It's not the 2000s anymore. There's no belief at all whatsoever that there will be a color revolution that will change his government. So he just really had gotten so much of what we left Afghanistan. We left Afghanistan last year. The U.S. had clearly, and even what's even funny too, is there are plenty of people on the right, center, and left who said, hey, we need to pivot away from Europe. Let's focus on what's happening in Asia.
That's still my position, actually.
And guess what? Putin did the worst thing for that argument. He was actually, and this is where once again, it's funny. People get this in the domestic context. Having super old leaders who are constitutionally stuck in the past without any actual check on their power is a disaster. It's such a normie, obvious MSNBC take, but it's just true. Having this 68-year-old person, no offense to any of our older listeners, who is obsessed with imperial Russia, obsessed with mistakes he thought the Soviet Union made, has been a disaster. But I want to get to the Sudetenland question, because You did a good monologue earlier in the week about the topic of the Putin Hitler comparison, and the thing I agree with you on is I do not think it is useful to call Putin Hitler. I don't think it's useful to call anybody, basically anyone else, because at the end of the day, there's the joke about everyone gets called a Nazi today, but Putin isn't Hitler at a literal level, but he also isn't on a couple of different levels. Like no one's claiming he's going to, he's given no indication, unlike Hitler, that he is going to pursue a genocidal campaign across all of Europe. Even in the 1930s, there are clear hints of that being true. Putin isn't that thing. That said, Putin, and this is where the Sudetenland, this is Hitler's initial successful effort to get the West to agree to give up a part of Czechoslovakia to him because he claimed German speakers were being discriminated against. Putin raises similar questions that Hitler's leadership of Nazi Germany raised. I think there were a bunch of people who were very online this week who, if they thought of this conflict through that lens, wouldn't have ended up with eggs on their face. So a couple questions raised by Putin and Germany, the Sudetenland, Ukraine. Okay, when someone threatens violence, if you give them what they want, does that result in peace or does that actually result in more aggression? Now, that question could go different ways, right? That's why we shouldn't overdo the Munich analogy. It could go a bunch of different ways, different
sometimes
times.
It actually works.
But it's an actually useful question to ask. And it's a question that comes from Munich. We were talking about this before this episode, but question that comes from the war in Iraq, regardless of what you think about it. The idea of a war of necessity, aka the war in Afghanistan, despite how it turned out, just the idea of, wow, the Afghanistan are literally holding terrorists who have declared war on us. We're going to overthrow the regime. That's a war of necessity. The war in Iraq, that's a war of choice. Moving forward, American precedents and Western leaders should ask themselves, when we are engaging in a military conflict, the following question: is it a war of necessity or is it a war of choice? Biden explicitly said, this is a war of choice. I am sympathetic to the Ukrainians. I don't like Putin. There will be consequences if he chooses to invade, but I am not placing American troops and American troops as a tripwire that could escalate. That is what taking a lesson from history would effectively be. I really just think we should reject a lot of folks who just say out of hand, don't talk about this historical event. Like, Saagar, but I'm more hawkish than you are. It would be total bullshit if I said, Saagar, no, you can't talk about Iraq. I'm tired of the Iraq analogy. Right. I don't want to hear about it now. I don't want to hear about Kabul falling, Saagar. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Find a different one. What I've just noticed that every single time people have said that aggressively on Twitter, what they've essentially meant by that is the example you're bringing up brings to mind really tough questions that I don't want to answer.
Yeah, I think, and this is always the issue, Marshall. I would say 99% of the people making Sudetenland don't know a goddamn thing about Munich and are unwilling to talk about it in that way and use it as a historical evocation without raising the nuanced question they pointed to. And I'm not even above it. It's funny, you and I were talking. I saw somebody who will remain nameless say that we should roll back NATO in response to what's happening. And look, I literally do not even believe that we should have added the Baltics to the NATO in the first place. That being said, rolling back from your existing treaty obligations in response to the Ukrainian invasion, that's actual appeasement. And that is where
it's like, that's actually like, Munich.
Okay. Like it's like we're getting close here. Okay. So like let's continue down the Munich thing. And actually, this is very controversial, but I actually commend Chamberlain and a lot of what the Brits did at the time, because what they did is the useful lesson to all of history by separating any legitimate grievance that you possibly had, that the Germans could possibly have, from their literal genocidal campaign. And I do think that that was important. So in that context, it was important to acknowledge at the time, which was widespread and was correct, that the Treaty of Versailles was deeply unfair to the Germans, and that you could understand how that unfair treaty led to the rise of Hitler, the collapse of Weimar Germany, and all of this. And then once you arrive then at that point, and then try and accommodate it as best as you can, and you still have somebody who chooses an explicit war within Europe, then the population, as well as all other options, are exhausted such that you have no choice but to fight. And so I think that this was a similar situation with respect to NATO. And we pointed this out. Putin got what he wanted. Said he wanted, not what he wanted. He got everything that he said that he wanted. And then he gives a speech where he casts himself as the next heir to the czar of all the Russias. And you're like, okay, dude, like that's what this is really about. And if you believe that, then I'm sorry, but then you're setting yourself up for a nuclear exchange. That's the truth. I mean, if you believe that Estonia, Lithuania, and all these, Latvia, are illegitimate countries, a la Ukraine, because remember, there's a reason he didn't start off with Ukraine. I did a whole monologue on this today about the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He explicitly attacked the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk because it granted the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk 1917 was a treaty signed by Lenin and Trotsky with the German Kaiser. It was the first historical acknowledgement of the independent states of Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Ukraine, as well as a few others. But those are the ones that mostly matter to the story. Now, from that point onward, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia were independent states from 1918 until 1939. Then they were taken over by the Soviet Union. But even then, after 1945, when they were codified to the Soviet Union, they were still admitted as independent district/states, meaning that whenever they broke off from the Soviet Union, they retained their independence as an actual country, which they had never been before. So when Putin attacks and opens the speech, opens it, and I encourage you all, go and read the English translation. I did, the official English translation from the Kremlin on the Kremlin's website. He opens the speech by explicitly calling Lenin a fool and attacking the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in order to say that the treaty itself was illegitimate and thus that the countries that stem from it are illegitimate themselves. So now we're not talking about NATO. You're declaring NATO countries themselves to be illegitimate in the eyes of your regime, such that they are subject to the total control of the Russian Empire like they were in the days of the Tsar. And I'm sorry, we don't live in 1850 anymore. That's just not going to happen. We fought multiple wars in order to make sure that that isn't. And that is a huge threat to the balance of power, obviously, in Europe, the eyes of the world, et cetera. Some of these things just sound so cliche because, frankly, I think neocons and others have way overused them, such that whenever they really matter right now, it almost sounds cliche in order to say it. But, this
it's true.
It's never right. But it's one of those things where words do have meaning and they should be used in context. And this is the context that we're in. So anyway, this is a very long-winded way of saying that the Putin speech to me was very seminal in showing what this is all really about. And that's, again, I just can't get over it. I mean, he is risking checkpoint Charlie level, eyeball to eyeball fights. For what? I just can't understand it.